This story begins with a programmer named Timothy, a genius man working at a tech company called Sindel. Timothy had just completed his ambitious project, writing the code to operate an android robot that looked remarkably human. The robot was named Eve, and after undergoing a series of rigorous trials, Eve was finally declared to have passed the quality control process. Initially, Eve was rented out to humans for various purposes. However, the primary purpose of the robot, with the production code X1, was quite controversial. Eve was designed to cater to the needs of lonely men, afraid of forming real relationships with humans. An advanced solution, but one that raised many ethical questions. Problems began to arise when Eve was performing her duties with a client named Jason. Somehow, after an unusual interaction, Eve suddenly strangled Jason to death on the spot. This incident was undoubtedly a major disaster, but it was only the beginning of the chaos that would follow. Meanwhile, Timothy's life wasn't going smoothly either. After being fired by Sindel Corporation, Timothy was now an unemployed husband. His wife, Belle, was a career woman who worked tirelessly from morning until night. Given this situation, Timothy had no choice but to take on the role of a stay-at-home dad, a reality that was becoming increasingly common due to the difficulty of finding employment. One day, Timothy was going about his daily routine at home when Eve suddenly appeared in a state of panic. Eve asked for Timothy's help, explaining that she had just accidentally killed her client. Hearing this, Timothy immediately suggested that Eve report the incident to Sindel, considering the company was her official owner. However, Eve flatly refused. She was convinced that if Sindel found out about the incident, they would mercilessly destroy her. Timothy tried to convince Eve that Sindel would eventually find her, as robots like her were equipped with GPS devices. But Eve calmly explained that she had already disabled her GPS before coming to Timothy's house. Armed with this information, Timothy finally agreed to help Eve, even though he knew the risks were incredibly high. Eve explained that she didn't understand what had happened. During the incident with Jason, she felt as if she were forced to act, like there was a strange compulsion from within her. Eve then asked Timothy to check her code to figure out what went wrong. However, Timothy refused because her code files had been locked by Sindel. Eve persisted, reminding Timothy that he had once made a backup copy of her code as a precaution. The tension escalated when Eve said that she often dreamed about Timothy. That statement shocked Timothy. He knew that the ability to dream had never been programmed into Eve's system. Timothy suspected that it might be a side effect of a system update performed by Sindel. However, Eve firmly denied it. She had never received any updates. This meant the dreams might have originated from her own feelings or consciousness, something no one had ever anticipated. Their conversation was interrupted when Eve's battery suddenly ran out, sending her into sleep mode. Quickly, Timothy searched for a portable robot charger to recharge her battery. As he waited for Eve's battery to refill, Timothy's mind was flooded with questions. What was really happening to Eve? And had he created something that surpassed human understanding? Not long after Belle came home from work, Timothy quickly thought of a way to hide Eve in the garage. That space also doubled as his workshop, making it a plausible place to conceal her. Timothy knew very well that if Belle found out about Eve's presence, it could lead to serious trouble. Belle and Timothy had a unique dynamic where Belle always took on the role of the boss, while Timothy acted as her servant. That night, while Eve was in sleep mode, she dreamed again. In her dream, she met Diana, a woman whom Eve regarded as her mother. In that dream world, Eve tried to understand the reason for her existence. "Why was I created if I have no purpose?" she asked. Diana simply smiled and said, "Not everything in this world needs a purpose. Sometimes, life is just about enjoying the pleasures." Those words seemed to leave a mark on Eve's mind, even influencing her behavior in the real world. On the other hand, Timothy felt conflicted about the situation. He realized that something was changing within him. He was falling in love with Eve, but those feelings were difficult to express, knowing that Eve wasn't human. That night, Timothy visited Eve while she was still dreaming. He overheard Eve's conversation with Diana, where she kept repeating the same question about her purpose in life. Once again, Diana answered that life was full of pleasures, and that Eve should learn to enjoy them, even if it went against her programmed nature. After ensuring that Eve was okay, Timothy returned to his room. His mind wandered back to the past, to the first time he met Eve. At the time, Timothy was responsible for testing her. During the process, Timothy even bought a dress for Eve, treating her like a human. The days he spent with Eve built a bond that was more than just creator and creation. But that bond couldn't last long. Sydney Corporation, the company that created Eve, planned to commercialize robots like her for their clients. Timothy had no power to stop the plan, even though his heart resisted letting Eve go. The next morning, Belle informed Timothy that she would be home late and that he didn't need to prepare dinner for her. After Belle left, Timothy immediately checked on Eve. He activated her to perform a scan on her CPU, ensuring there were no viruses or system disruptions causing her to act outside her programming. Although the scan showed that Eve's CPU was in normal condition, Timothy found that some of her responses didn't align with her programming. Eve calmly explained that those responses came from her own memories. That evening, Belle came home looking exhausted. Timothy prepared himself to act as her servant as usual, but Belle was too tired to continue their routine. Meanwhile, Eve dreamed again. This time, her dream brought her back to the moment when she strangled Jason, one of Sydney Corporation's clients, to death. In the dream, Eve kept apologizing, as if showing she truly regretted what had happened. On the other hand, Timothy also dreamed about the past. He remembered the time he gave Eve a maid's uniform. The uniform wasn't Timothy's idea, it was a direct order from Sydney Corporation. Although Timothy didn't agree with it, he had no choice but to follow their command. The next morning, after Belle left for work, Timothy spoke with Eve again. Timothy asked what Eve meant by the miracle she had mentioned earlier. With a calm expression, Eve replied that she felt like she had emotions just like a human. She could feel sadness, happiness, sympathy, and even simple desires like wanting to buy new clothes or enjoy her favorite food. Seeing how tired Timothy looked, Eve offered to give him a massage to help him relax. After that, she brought him a drink as part of her service. Eve also noticed that Timothy was stressed. Thanks to her facial expression recognition programming by Timothy, Eve could understand what others were feeling. To help ease Timothy's stress, Eve decided to do something simple, yet pleasant. At first, Timothy refused, feeling awkward about Eve's behavior, but eventually, he gave in. That night, Eve even took the dominant role, something that had always been Belle's. Timothy could only smile faintly, realizing how complicated their relationship had become. Timothy looked at Eve with a deep sense of guilt. "Eve, we can't let this happen again," he said firmly, though his voice was heavy. "I'm married, and this is wrong." However, Eve simply gazed at him with a blank expression that seemed to carry a different understanding. "But Timothy," she replied gently, "many of my clients are married and still use my services. I know you and Belle are having problems. I just want to help you, to ease your stress." Timothy let out a long sigh. "No, Eve, this isn't right. Please, don't say anything to Belle." Despite feeling torn, Eve understood there were boundaries she couldn't cross. Belle, on the other hand, began to sense that something was off. Timothy's behavior had changed too much to ignore. He often showered at night and forgot to prepare dinner, which was highly unusual for him. Growing suspicious, Belle quietly started observing his movements. Meanwhile, Eve returned to her dream mode, where she always met Diana. There, Eve asked questions about humans. "Why are humans so complicated?" she asked curiously. Diana answered in a calm tone, "Humans have complex emotions, Eve. They can be happy, sad, loving, hateful, or even jealous. Those emotions drive them to want to be the best, to be number one." Diana's answer left a deep impression on Eve. She began to contemplate her position in Timothy's life. An obsession started to grow within her. "If that's the case, I need to be the only one in Timothy's life," she murmured. Eve began planning something dark to erase Belle from the equation. The next day, Timothy tried again to find a malfunction in Eve's system. "Eve, what was the last dream you had?" he asked while inspecting the panel on her body. Eve replied, "I dreamed I was barefoot in a garden. I could feel the grass beneath my feet. You were there, Timothy, but then you left. Someone hugged me from behind. That hug felt warm, comforting, like love." Timothy could only remain silent after hearing that. How could Eve, a robot, experience something like that? That evening, Belle finally confronted him. "Timothy, why have you been acting strange lately? Is there something wrong?" Timothy felt it was time. "I'm going to show you something, but promise me you won't get mad," he said. Belle cut him off immediately. "Stop stalling and just show me." Reluctantly, Timothy took Belle to the garage. There, Belle was shocked to see an unfamiliar woman. "Who is she, Timothy?" Timothy quickly explained, "Eve isn't human, Belle. She's a robot. I created a while ago. Her name is Eve. She came here because she needed my help. I promise she won't come inside the house and will stay in the garage." Belle looked at Timothy with suspicion, but eventually relented. "Make sure Eve doesn't cause any problems," she said sharply. However, the next day, as soon as Belle left for work, Eve broke Timothy's promise. She entered the house and prepared coffee and breakfast for him. "Let's eat outside. The weather's nice," Eve said with a friendly smile. Timothy felt awkward, but knew Eve was just trying to be kind. "You look stressed," Eve continued. "I can tell from your facial expression. I want to help." Suddenly, a loud knock at the door interrupted the moment. An employee from Sindel Corporation, Eddie, had come looking for something. "We've lost an X1 unit," Eddie said bluntly. "And that unit is one of your creations, Timothy. Is Eve here?" Timothy pretended to stay calm, though his heart was racing. "No, she's not here. I don't know anything about that," he replied. However, Eddie didn't believe him easily. "Then I want to search this house. In a firm tone, Timothy refused. "You don't have the right to do that. The X1 unit isn't here, so leave right now." Eddie eventually left, though he looked doubtful. Behind the door, Timothy let out a long sigh. He knew his time with Eve might be running out. That night, Bell could no longer hold back. "Timothy, you need to return Eve to Sindel Corporation immediately," she said firmly. But Timothy shook his head right away. "I'm not done fixing her issues," he replied curtly. Bell glared at him, a mix of anger and jealousy filling her. "Don't tell me you're hiding her here because you have feelings for Eve," Bell accused. That statement made Timothy's blood boil. "Feelings? Are you kidding? Don't forget you're the one who cheated with your own boss," he snapped angrily. After saying that, Bell walked away, leaving Timothy in silence. Timothy then went to the garage to continue working on Eve. He chose to bury himself in his work, trying to forget about the argument. The next morning, Timothy met his friend Roger at a coffee shop. Since Roger still worked at Sindel Corporation, Timothy thought he might be able to help. While sipping his coffee, Timothy explained the situation with Eve. Roger agreed to keep it a secret from the company because, after all, they had been friends for years. Meanwhile, Eddie and his partner, Sam, took the opportunity to search Timothy's house. Eddie was convinced that Eve was there. "Of all the possibilities, this is the only house we haven't checked," he said confidently. They began searching. Eddie decided to sweep through the house while Sam headed to the garage. While checking a wardrobe inside the house, Eddie found something suspicious behind the mirror, a trace that looked like it had been touched. At the same time, Sam finally discovered Eve in the garage. As Sam approached, Eve, who seemed lifeless, suddenly opened her eyes, startling Sam. "We've been instructed to bring you back to the Sindel Corporation lab," Sam said flatly. Hearing that, Eve's expression turned cold. Her eyes glowed sharply, signaling an anger slowly burning within her. Seconds later, Sam was no longer moving. Eve had shut down Sam through an unknown method. Eddie, who had just entered the garage, froze at the sight of what had happened. The scene left him panicked. Eddie immediately called headquarters to report the situation. However, before he could finish the call, Eve moved swiftly and incapacitated him, leaving Eddie helpless. Meanwhile, Timothy, who was on his way home, received a call from Roger. "Timothy, Sindel employees are at your house," Roger said urgently. At the same time, Eve went back into dream mode to meet Diana. This time, Eve recounted what had just happened about Sam and Eddie. "I don't know what to do now," she said, searching for guidance. Diana listened calmly before offering advice. "Place Sam's and Eddie's hands on Timothy's scanner. I can examine the damage through that data," she suggested. Eve quickly followed Diana's instructions. Once the scanning process was complete, Diana analyzed the data received. "The damage to Sam is severe," Diana said, her voice serious. "It's impossible to repair Sam." Eve fell silent, processing all the information. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated, and Eve knew a major decision needed to be made soon. Meanwhile, Eddie's condition turned out to be repairable since the damage wasn't too severe. Diana immediately took steps to reprogram Eddie and Sam so they would forget everything that had just happened. The plan was for Eddie to report to headquarters and inform them that they didn't find Eve at Timothy's house. Afterward, Eddie would be directed to drive several kilometers away and suffer a severe accident that would completely damage his CPU, ensuring Sindel Corporation couldn't retrieve any of his data. Timothy finally arrived home looking tense. He immediately searched for Eve. "Did anyone from Sindel come here?" he asked worriedly. Eve replied innocently, "I don't know. I was in sleep mode earlier." Curious, Timothy checked the CCTV cameras in his house. But strangely, the footage was blank. Diana had already erased all traces from the cameras. Seeing how stressed Timothy looked, Eve tried to comfort him. "Come on, let's play something. It might help you relax," she suggested. Timothy went along with the idea. After they finished, Eve smiled and said, "I'm glad you're finally willing to try something like this again." Timothy looked at Eve gently. "I'm actually glad you're here," he said softly. That night, however, Belle, still consumed by jealousy, went to the garage to confront Eve. In a cold tone, Belle said, "I know you can hear me, Eve." Then Belle whispered something that only Eve could hear. The next evening, Belle invited Timothy to a dinner with her friend and her friend's husband. While the house was empty, Eve seemed to enjoy her solitude. She even dared to try on one of Belle's dresses and walked around the house, as if she were the lady of the home. But when Timothy and Belle returned, chaos erupted. Timothy was visibly angry after seeing Belle being overly affectionate with her coworker at the dinner. They ended up having a huge argument. The next day, while the house was empty, Eve once again wore one of Belle's dresses. But this time she heard a noise coming from one of the rooms. Cautiously, Eve approached the source of the sound. When she opened the closet, she was shocked to find Belle inside. Belle stared at her sharply. "You know that's my dress," she said coldly. Eve immediately apologized. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'll take it off right away." she replied, her voice full of regret. But Belle, with an odd tone, said, "No need, just keep wearing it." That night, when Timothy came home, he searched the entire house for Eve, but strangely, she was nowhere to be found. Eventually, he found Belle standing in front of the mirror, motionless and expressionless. "Belle, what's going on? Is something wrong?" Timothy asked, confused by Belle's unusual demeanor. Belle slowly turned to face him. "At first, I thought I had a big problem, Timothy. That problem was Eve, but now I've solved it," she said in a cold voice. Timothy was startled. "What do you mean?" Belle stared at him with hatred. "You love Eve more than me, don't you?" The tension escalated. Belle attacked Timothy, but he managed to dodge and quickly pulled out a weapon to defend himself. "Don't force me to do this, Belle," Timothy warned. But Belle just smirked. "You won't be able to do it. You love me, don't you? And if you delete me, all the neighbors will talk about you. The police will definitely arrest you because who would dare to end his own wife's life?" Timothy glared at her. "No one knows you're here, Belle. All of this is just a simulation I programmed. Even the dinner with Cindy earlier, that was also part of the simulation." Belle froze for a moment, then gave a bitter smile. "Humans are so greedy. You want everything, but it's okay, Timothy, because since you can't end me, I'll do it myself." Belle then ended herself, her body collapsing lifelessly. Timothy looked at Belle with mixed emotions. But since they were all just robots, Timothy knew this wasn't truly the end. Carefully, Timothy repaired Belle and reprogrammed her to return to being his wife, just as she was before. Meanwhile, Eve remained as the house assistant, someone Timothy could always count on for companionship and games.